Welcome back to the School of Muscle. Today, I'm honored to be joined by Dr. Jose Antonio here again. He was on the podcast previously, and we discussed some of his work on kind of high protein diets and some very interesting things there. But today, we're going to cover a little bit different of a topic, and that is going to be creatine here. And first off, thanks for coming on here, Dr. Antonio.
Hey, very welcome. I look forward to a fun conversation.
And Dr. Antonio recently authored a study in 2021 titled Common Questions and Misconceptions About Creatine Supplementation. What does the scientific evidence really show? And that's going to be what we dive into today. And I think most people listening probably have the understanding or have heard that creatine is relatively safe and it's effective for improving muscle mass, performance, recovery, different things along those lines. But there are some kind of common questions that I tend to get a lot as a coach, and I know that are kind of floating around there. And you see some people say stuff out on the internet and get asked questions a lot about it as well. And you guys did a really good job in this article of kind of covering some of these main questions. So that's kind of what we're going to dive into today. And I think the good place to start here, and one of the first questions that you guys covered in this paper was whether creatine causes water retention. So I think that would be a good place for us to start here. So does creatine cause water retention?
Well, I think the qualified answer to that is generally not. Now, having done research on creatine going back many, many years, there's always, and it's usually from women. I don't think I've ever gotten this complaint from men, but usually women will say, "I feel bloated." Okay. Now, the problem with the notion or the idea of feeling bloated is that it's not really a scientific term. So when someone says, "Well, I feel bloated when I take creatine," and then when I don't take it, I'm not bloated, I'm like, well, then just don't take creatine. I mean, whatever that bloating is, they always describe it as some feeling of fullness, they're retaining fluid or whatnot. I'm like, hey, I don't know what that means, but it means something to you, so don't take it. And there are people who do that, and I'm like, you know what? That's fine. It's not a big deal. Now, when you look at some of the data of, and if you use, let's say, a device, a bioelectrical impedance analysis device, which can measure total body water, if you do take creatine, typically in 4 to 8 weeks, you'll get, roughly maybe a 4 to 5 pound increase in lean body mass, roughly. Now, obviously, if lean body mass is mostly muscle mass, we know that muscle mass in large part is composed of water. So in a sense, you are gaining water because water is considered lean body mass. In fact, if you get let's say a DEXA scan, I don't know if you've ever been scanned through a DEXA for body composition. You can get bone, obviously bone mineral content, bone mineral density. You get fat mass, and then everything else is lean body mass. But what's lean body mass? It's skeletal muscle, it's organs, it's water, it's blood. So when the consumer hears lean body mass, they hear skeletal muscle. When I hear lean body mass, I hear anything that's not fat and anything that's not bone. So it's almost like we're not talking about the same thing, even though skeletal muscle makes up the largest depot of lean body mass. I mean, and let's face it, when you lift weights, it's not like you're getting bigger organs, unless you're taking PEDs, but you're getting larger skeletal muscle. So do some people feel like they gain an excess amount of water? And I think that's what it boils down to. There are people who say they do. Whether or not it's measured, they say they feel it. And hey, it's a subjective feeling. I'm like, okay, well, I tell people who get that feeling or sensation from creatine is, why don't you lower the dose a little? Instead of 5 grams a day, maybe try 3 grams a day. Because I take 3 grams a day. Maybe it feels different on 3 grams a day. So if there's a little bit of self-experimentation, I think most people will realize that. And certainly guys don't care about the water. I mean, even if they gain water, I think it makes them seem fuller, or their muscles feel fuller. So, but in general, I think the qualified answer is generally not, in terms of, excess fluid retention.
I'd be interested in how much of it is just the psychological impact of someone seeing their weight kind of jump up a little bit on creatine to where they see the scale move up by a couple of pounds. They might just automatically associate that with kind of feeling a little bit more bloated and just not feeling as good. So my guess is there might be some psychological stuff going on there as well. Would it be fair to say that in conclusion on this point, you might see your weight increase a little bit, but from a kind of visual look standpoint, just taking creatine probably isn't going to make you look worse and look bloated, but some people do experience kind of this feeling of bloat potentially because of the weight gain associated with creatine.
Yeah, I think Ryan, that's an absolutely fair assessment. I think that's a good way to describe it. Absolutely.
Perfect. Well, moving on to kind of the next question that you guys covered, and I tend to get this question a lot as well, and it's, does creatine result in kidney damage? And this is definitely one that I've heard here or there. But what does the evidence show on this one?
Wow, this is what's so annoying about this is I've also heard this about protein, and I'm sure you have too. For whatever reason, and it's not just coming from physicians or healthcare providers, it's coming from sort of the common consumer. For whatever reason, I can't figure out why is it always the kidneys they pick on? Protein bad for your kidneys, creatine bad for your kidneys. What is it about the kidneys? Why not the liver? Why not the heart? No, kidney. So this is it's so absurd. And here's the thing: I deal with this at the level of the university. I teach a sports nutrition course, and before this, at the start of the semester, I'll ask students, what have you heard about creatine? And it always comes up, oh, you get cramps or it's bad for your kidneys. And I ask, well, who do you hear this from? They're like, my friends tell me this, blah blah blah. And I'm like, well, your friends don't know anything. I don't listen to your friends. But but there's no evidence. There's literally no evidence that creatine causes any harm to your kidneys. It's just it doesn't even make any mechanistic sense because you make a normal amount of creatine anyways. And also if you consume meat, particularly fish, you're consuming creatine. So the idea that it would harm your kidneys, one, there's no basis in terms of evidence, and two, it doesn't even make sense. So why people say that, I think there's this weird and it's not just creatine. I think there's a weird anti-supplement bias that the general consumer has, not just the consumer. I should also say that most healthcare providers have physicians,
Hmm.
nurses, maybe a few dietitians. I mean, that's changing, thank God. But they have this anti-supplement bias, which I've always found to be really weird because it's not coming from a place of science. It's coming from a place of ideological indoctrination. It's like they've been indoctrinated. This is what they were taught, whatever, in graduate school or medical school, and so it's what they'll say until the day they die. It's just absolutely absurd.
Absolutely. I think Dr. Mike Israetel has talked about this in regards to like the naturalistic fallacy, in which people automatically assume that if something is like not a supplement or is natural, it automatically means it's better. And it's just not necessarily supported by the research. If a supplement is suggested to be effective by these longitudinal studies and the body of evidence suggests that, then there's not harm in supplementing with it. So for kidneys,
Right.
creatine, not something you need to worry about. I would also go to say protein. You're probably the same boat there, but we probably covered that in our high protein conversation. I'm sure when you did your studies on the relatively higher protein amounts that you got a lot of backlash for protein damaging the kidneys and can't be safe. And is that true?
Well, I remember first of all, when we initially started this, and we're going back, the idea came up around 2014. And when I came up with the idea, it was really because I had bodybuilders who were taking my classes and I just randomly asked them stuff. And the reason it came up is because there was one particular guy who, and you know this, they always carry the big water jug and they're always eating. I'm like, you know what, maybe you
Yeah.
should pay attention class, stop eating. Because all you do is eat and all you do is drink. Pay attention. You might learn something. I mean, I was just giving him a hard time. And he's like, okay,
Yeah.
okay, Dr. Antonio, okay. Um, and so just out of the blue, I said, how much do you eat? What do you eat? And I want to know calories and protein. And when he told me the protein, I'm like, oh, wow, that's like over 3 grams per kilo. That's a lot of protein. I mean, not many people can do that. And so I thought, you know what? Okay, someone has to do it. So I'm going to do a study. Just have guys and girls eat a bucket full of protein, try to go up to 2 grams per pound or 4.4 grams per kilo. We did it. A lot of people dropped out because it's hard to eat that much protein. That's one. But the people who did it without changing their training, nothing happened. They didn't gain weight, they didn't lose weight, nothing. So we just kept following it up with other studies, and we sort of found this sweet spot of, I think most people can do 3 grams per kilo. It's hard, but it's doable. We did that, and we found out if you change your training, you can lose more fat mass, but you still gain lean body mass on a high protein diet. There seems to be a limit. Once you get to about a gram per pound, that's enough for lean body mass gain. But if you exceed a gram per pound, maybe it helps you lose fat. So okay, that's a value to bodybuilders, and it's probably a value to a lot of athletes. But we did a lot of safety stuff. We looked at their metabolic panels, and here's the funny part. All my friends are like, we know nothing's going to happen. And I'm like, I know nothing's going to happen. That's what's so goofy about this. A lot of my sports science friends are like, a lot of them actually came. The reason they got their PhDs is they were what I would call former bodybuilders. They're like, this stuff's kind of cool. I want to study it. And we all thought, in a way, what a waste of time, because we know it won't do anything to your kidneys. We know it because we did it to ourselves. But you know what? Hey, let's do a study and see what happens. And here's the funny part, and you'll like this, Ryan. It doesn't fucking matter if you do the studies. It doesn't. Because there are idiots out there who they're like, oh, well, okay, you did it for eight weeks. What if you do it for a year? I'm like, okay, I'll do it for a year. Okay, we didn't find anything. And then I remember this guy, a friend of mine texted me. He's like, watch it. Someone on Facebook will say 1 year's not enough. You need to do like 5 years or 10 years or whatever. And what do you know? A couple days later, I look on Facebook. I'm like, some idiot. Well, you know what? 1 year? Okay, maybe there's nothing wrong with 1 year. But what if you went like 5 years? I'm like, you idiot. Who's going to do a 5-year study? Nobody. You can't do a 5-year study. We did do a 2-year study, though. We did a 2-year one, and
which is crazy in itself.
Right. I'm like, we found nothing again. It's safe. So it's funny how people move the goalposts, because they're married, they get married to an idea, and they will never divorce themselves from the idea, even when evidence shows that they're wrong. It's the weirdest thing. I mean, we've seen this in the last 3 years, just how weird it is. It's the idea that, and I don't know who this quote I attributed to, but it's a great quote. It's easier to fool someone than it is to convince them they've been fooled. And all these people have been fooled, but they don't want to admit they've been fooled. So yeah, the whole protein. I mean, it's an eye opener when you show them data, and they're like, not good enough for me. You better do that 20-year study until they die, and then we'll look at their kidneys, and then maybe we'll know. I'm like, you're an idiot. You're an idiot.
Yeah, there's just some people that it's never going to be good enough. Like you said, they're always going to keep moving that goalpost, and just they're never going to come to terms with, okay, the evidence suggests here that I'm actually wrong. So I think that was a nice little sidebar there, just to cover high protein diets, also safe for your kidneys alongside creatine. So
I will say, this is a sort of a quick sidebar diversion. When you and I are familiar with the analogy of moving goalposts, because it's in football.
Yep.
But people who don't watch football have no idea what that really means. They're like, moving the goalpost? What's that analogy? And it's like, football, goalpost, whatever. And also in Europe, because no one gives a shit about American football in Europe.
Yeah.
So it's just funny, because someone brought that up. And they're like, what do you mean moving the goalpost? Is there something else we could use an analogy? I'm like, I'll think about it, but I like goalposts. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. Well, I think that covers that one well. And kind of another one that I get quite a bit, and I'm not as well versed in kind of the literature on this one, but often people say that if you consume creatine on a regular basis, it will increase your kind of propensity for baldness and increases hair loss. So is there any truth behind that claim?
What's funny is I had this conversation with two other guys who do creatine research, Darren Candow and Scott Forbes. They're Canadian scientists. And of course, we're all bald. The three of us, we're like, oh my God, we're like the wrong people to ask. Well, here's the thing. It's based on this one study where, and it hasn't been replicated. That's what's so weird. Creatine increased levels of DHT, dihydrotestosterone. Okay. Supposedly, if you have elevated levels of DHT, it predisposes you to male pattern baldness, et cetera, et cetera. When you look at the actual data, so, most people won't actually dive into the actual data. When you look at the actual data, they actually had, and there's a range, obviously, with DHT or testosterone or estradiol, there's always a range. When you look at the actual numbers for DHT in that study, it was like, okay, they're within the normal range and almost sort of the low normal range. So that's where they started. When they took creatine, DHT did go up, but again, it's still within the normal range. I mean, So you went from low normal to mid normal. How would that have an effect on male pattern baldness when it's still within the normal range? That's one. So it didn't make sense. There wasn't like this crazy increase in DHT. So that's number one. Number two, and this is important. A lot of people forget the the country, and maybe this will be a trivial. This will be a sort of a multiple choice question for you, Ryan. What
Mhm.
country consumes 20% of the world's fish and therefore probably more creatine than other countries? Is it China? Is it Taiwan? Excuse me, China, Japan, the United States, or France?
I mean, I would guess Japan,
20% of the
but
world's fish. You
oh
are
god,
absolutely right. It's Japan. Japan
cool.
literally, that one tiny country, oh, they're not tiny, tiny, but they're small. They consume 20% of the world's fish. And I think their population, my memory correct, like 120-ish million, I think. Um, so you would think if they're consuming all that fish, there would be much higher levels of baldness in that country. And to my knowledge, there's no evidence that they're any more bald than any other group of people. So you got those two things going on. And also mechanistically, it doesn't make sense that creatine would cause any kind of baldness because, other than the DHT, which, hasn't been replicated, it's a normal part of your, you make it normally, even if you don't eat meat. I mean, but if you don't eat meat at all and you're a pure vegan, you may not make enough, to matter. But it just doesn't make sense mechanistically. There's, people in Japan, obviously, they're, in fact, you might argue they have more hair than the average American or European. They don't get bald. A lot of Asians don't get bald the way a lot of Caucasians do. And that's just my personal observation since I'm Asian. Um, but yeah, mechanistically, it doesn't make sense.
Gotcha. And I will say that you totally nailed it on the population of Japan. It looks like 125 million is right on the target.
Wow.
So
Yeah.
very nice
Okay. I
estimate
don't know if I
there.
remember that.
So cool. Yeah. So it sounds like creatine, you may see a little bit of an, like a slight increase in DHT, which might be related to hair loss, but it still is an increase usually within the normal ranges. So it still
Yeah.
doesn't make sense for why creatine mechanistically would cause hair loss. And also, like you mentioned, in populations that eat quite a bit of fish, which also likely has creatine in it, then you still don't see like a disproportionate amount of hair loss in those populations. Does that sound like a pretty good summary there?
No, that's a great summary. And I want to, I don't know if your audience will give a shit about statistics, but a little sidebar there because this is important. So in that study on DHT, there was what scientists would refer to as a statistically significant increase in DHT. So, and that's verbiage you see in a lot of studies. There's a statistically significant increase in blah, 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 which is true. And one of the first things we teach, not just grad students, but even undergrads, is that you can have something that's statistically significant, but the real question is it physiologically meaningful or is it physiologically significant? Let me give you an example that has nothing to do with creatine. There's on social media, there was a lot of talk about a particular study that showed that cold water immersion promotes the loss of body fat, and I think these were military recruits in some European country. And that's what it says in the abstract. It's like, oh, you lose fat if you dip in cold water. And then I start looking at the data, and it's like, yeah, there is a statistically significant decrease in, let's say, waist circumference. But when I looked at the actual data, I'm like, 1.1 centimeters? We're talking about 1.1 centimeters? That's meaningless. If someone said, I'm going to put you on a training program to lose fat and you're going to lose 1.1 centimeters around your waist, you'd be like, you're an idiot. I mean, that is one of the best examples of statistical significance, but no meaning. There's nothing meaningful physiologically, and that's where a lot of people they get once they see, oh, it's significant. Well, it must be true. Well, it could be significant statistically, but it may be meaningless, and that's what this DHT thing is. At the end of the day, it was a meaningless change.
Yep, I think that's a really good point. And you see this all over the place on the internet where, I mean, for people that don't have any background in statistics and haven't had any understanding of this, I can see why they might take something and run with it. But you'll often, even like people that should know, they'll say things like, oh, there's a significant increase in muscle mass when doing this intervention. And it's like, you're
Right.
not technically wrong. It was statistically significant, but these individuals saw like, half of an ounce of an increase in muscle mass over the time course of however long. So it's not an actual significant difference. Yes, statistically significant, but not significant overall. So
Right.
I think that's a really important point to consider.
Right. And the opposite is also true. Like for instance, when you're dealing with elite athletes or world class athletes, let's say you take sprinters and let's say they do a training program and it cuts 1/10 of a second off their time. To the average layperson, like 1/10 of a second, that's nothing. No, to an elite sprinter, that's a lot. Because that's the difference between first, second, third, fourth, or fifth. So it goes both ways, and people have to be cognizant of the population that's being studied. So, to you and I, and maybe more to you since you're leaner than me, if you lost 10 pounds of fat, I mean, that'd be a lot to you, right? But if a
Hmm.
sumo wrestler lost 10 pounds of fat, I don't think it would make a difference, for a
Hmm.
sumo wrestler. So yeah, it depends on the population.
Yep, absolutely. Cool. Well, I think that covers that one well. And the next one I want to move on to here is the dosage of creatine. So some people will say, well, we could start out with maybe part one to this question is what is kind of a nice recommended daily dosage for creatine? And then part two of this would be, should you load your creatine or go through a loading phase in which you eat or consume quite a bit of creatine for several days in a row to kind of saturate your muscles and stuff like that. So what's kind of the evidence suggest here?
I'll answer those backwards. I think the loading phase in general is not needed unless, number one, you're not taking creatine presently and you want to get as quick an effect as possible. So that's one. But in general, it's not needed. And the daily dose that seems to work best is at minimum 3 grams a day. And you don't even have to exceed 5 grams a day. Now, there's a caveat here, and this might be a question you ask later on. Speaking to people who study the cognitive effects of creatine, it might be likely that the 5 gram dose, good for skeletal muscle, but maybe you need more for the brain. And that's where people say, "Hey, I take 10 grams a day," and before I'd be like, "Yeah, that's too much," but now I'm thinking maybe to get effects as it relates to the brain, maybe we need a higher dose. So you're not technically wasting that extra 5 grams if we've always said 5 grams a day. What if you do 10 grams a day? Um, it might be needed. I mean, we need more data in terms of cognition, but there's not a downside. If you're doing 10 grams a day, I can't think of a downside other than I think creatine just costs a lot more these days. I mean, so there's that issue. But if you don't give a shit about that, then, I would say do 10 grams a day. But for now, if all you care about skeletal muscle, 5 grams a day is fine.
Perfect. And is there evidence to suggest that that should scale based on someone's body mass at all? So like if someone's, a 250-pound athlete and they're a big tall guy and they're muscular, does the evidence suggest that that guy might need a little bit more creatine compared to maybe someone that's, a buck 65 and quite a bit smaller?
Intuitively, you would think that, right? And if you look at most of the studies on creatine, you're talking about when it's guys, you're talking about guys between 70 and 85 kilos or, 150 to 200 pounds. There's really not that many studies of guys who are 250 to 300. With that said, if you are consuming 5 grams a day, eventually you will saturate skeletal muscle. It may take a little longer than someone who's under 50, but I think eventually you'll get there. And certainly if you're doing 10 grams a day, you'll get there even faster. But it does make sense. But again, with these studies, the limitation is you're typically talking about people between 150 pounds and maybe 200 to 210 pounds.
And one other question that I often get from clients is, they might go on a trip and they're gone for a few days and they don't want to worry about bringing their creatine and they come back and they miss a few days. Is there anything different that they should do when they come back from those few days off? Or are they good to just kind of get back into consuming that, 5 gram dose per day dosage? Or what do you kind of recommend when it comes to something like that?
It's interesting because when I went with my wife and kids on a cruise last week, I'm like, should I bring all my pills and supplements? And then I decided not to. I was thinking I'll give myself like a 5 day holiday. Will it matter if I go cold turkey on creatine for 5 days? Then when I come back, probably not. However, the caveat is this: I don't make money as an athlete, so it doesn't really matter. I,
Yeah.
I do it for myself.
Yep.
If if you're an athlete that makes money off, that's how you make a living, I would say you should probably bring this stuff with you whenever you travel, just because tiny, tiny differences between athlete A and athlete B could mean the difference between winning and losing. So with that, I would have them pack all that stuff during that break, or during that vacation. Now, if someone forgot, and when they come back, I would just say just resume your normal schedule, because a week out of the year isn't going to matter. And if you went cold turkey, it's going to take you 4 to 6 weeks for creatine to go back to baseline anyway. So a few days isn't going to matter.
Yep, absolutely. I think having that contact stuff, like if it's an elite athlete, then yes, do everything you can to stack the odds in your favor. Probably bring it, and don't forget days. But for the average,
Yeah.
like general population person looking to build muscle and lose fat, missing a few days out of the year for creatine isn't going to be a big deal. You can come back to your normal
Right.
dosage. And I would also say that, in terms of things that are going to get you your results, creatine is still relatively small on that list. Like just because you consume creatine isn't going to get you like your dream physique. It can definitely help, but it's not going to be the main thing driving that effect. So when we consider that, plus just missing it for a few days out of the year, I generally tell clients just get back to a regular dose and not really worry about it a whole lot.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that advice. That's great advice.
Perfect. And I think one final question here before wrapping is, you might hear that there's these certain kinds of creatine that are best, like marketing companies or different companies like that tend to like say, we have this proprietary mix of creatine that is superior to other forms. Is there any evidence to support that there's like special forms of creatine that are good, or what should people kind of stick with when thinking about a certain type of creatine?
Yeah, in terms of other forms other than creatine monohydrate, there's none that have been shown to be better. And this is what's weird. It's like, okay, how much better could it get? So I know there are some that claim, our form of creatine is absorbed better. Well, creatine monohydrate's already absorbed, like 99% of it is absorbed. So what is it, 100%? Is anything ever absorbed 100%? And then when you do there's head-to-head comparisons looking at body composition, after whatever, 4 weeks of training, 6 weeks of training, it either is the same or worse, believe it or not. I know there's data on creatine monohydrate versus creatine ethyl ester. Creatine monohydrate did better. I think ethyl ester was one of those that was highly promoted as being sort of the better mousetrap. And to date, 99% of the data is on creatine monohydrate. Can you make it better? If you can't, I don't know how. I think where we are now with creatine monohydrate is people are picky about the delivery system. Do they want to add powder to a protein shake? Do they want to consume capsules? Like right now, I consume capsules just because that's just what I've done. And now they have creatine gummies. Would that be better? Well, if you go to work and you bring your 3 or 4 or whatever 5 gummies and you just kind of eat them while you're you know working mindlessly, maybe that's better because it might help compliance. So whatever helps compliance to me is what you should do. If you're used to putting a scoop of creatine powder in your protein shake and blending it, just keep doing it because obviously you've complied with that behavior and that works. But I think what's important is that people find a time that they can comply with. People say, "Well, should I do it in morning or night?" I'm like, it doesn't matter. Just do it when it's convenient for you. Because at the end of the day, as you know, with exercise, with diet, with supplementation, it's all about adherence. If you don't adhere, it's sort of like, well, why even start if you're not going to stick to it?
Yeah, absolutely. As you were saying that, it kind of reminded me of the advice I give to a lot of clients when it comes to, getting in their training, in which it's like, at the end of the day, you're probably going to adapt to whatever time you train at, and it's not going to make a huge difference in the long run. So train whenever it's most convenient. So it sounds like for creatine, use the form that is most convenient for you to get in daily. And maybe real quick here, you kind of mentioned the timing a little bit there. Does the timing of creatine matter a whole lot, or does it just matter that you get it in before the end of the day and get it in on a daily consistent basis?
Well, what's interesting is I think about 10 years ago, myself and a student, she needed a project and we decided, hey, why don't we just compare creatine before and after training? Like, okay, well, it's simple enough. And we found that there was a marginal benefit to consuming it better after you train. I'm like, this is kind of interesting. because no one really ever paid attention to it. And then Dr. Candow, Dr. Forbes, and other creatine researchers, they, followed up with more extensive studies showing that it doesn't matter whether it's pre or post. But we did do something really cool. So it doesn't matter pre-post, just take it when it's convenient. What about if you take it during training? Hey, that's kind of, some people, they bring their container with whatever's in it, beta alanine, creatine, and they drink it while they train. Well, that actually is also a viable alternative in terms of time of day you want to take it. Now, me personally, I actually just take it in the morning because I got, a bucket full of pills and I just take them in the morning because that's what I do. Do I take stuff when I work out? No, I mean, unless I need sugar and caffeine, in the middle of a workout. But timing in general does not matter. What's more important is compliance, and you stick to it every day.
Perfect. Well, I think that covers a whole bunch of questions about creatine. So hopefully that helps the audience out on some of these very common questions and debunking some potential myths around your kidneys and different things like that. So thank you so much for coming on. If people want to keep up to date on things that you're doing and content you're producing, where can people go to find you?
There's a couple things. One, I don't know if you're a conference nerd, the International Society Sports Nutrition Conference is June 15 to 17, Fort Lauderdale Beach. Beautiful beach. Even if you get bored listening to a bunch of eggheads, you can always go to the beach, get some food, drink a beer, walk up and down the boardwalk. It's a lot of fun. So that's June 15 to 17. The website is issn.net, issn.net. Also, you can find me on Twitter. It's Jose Antonio, PhD. Also on Instagram, you can find me under the ISSN. And also, unlike a lot of people, and although not many scientists, myself and a colleague, we actually started a podcast called the Sports Science Dudes. We started in February. We have about 13 episodes, so we're going to start interviewing a bunch of other scientists just to get more science info out there for the general public. So, but I appreciate Ryan, you inviting me. I didn't know if I could talk today because my nose was all clogged, but I think I did okay. So.
Yeah, I think you did great. Well, thank you so much for coming out. I'll make sure to get all that stuff linked in the description box and all that stuff. And yeah, thanks for joining me today.
Oh, thanks, Ryan. Appreciate it.